Born November 27, 1883, Lieutenant Harvey Cockshutt was the only son of James and Mary, who lived at 40 Lorne Crescent in Brantford. As a member of one of the most prominent families in the city, Harvey didn't need to enlist. After being locally educated at Brantford Collegiate Institute, Cockshutt graduated with credit from McGill University and began working for his father's company, the Cockshutt Plough Works, as a sales manager. He eventually became the foreign sales manager for the Plough Works and completed a trip to Australia, as well as being elected a director of the company before the outbreak of the war. As described by the Brantford Expositor, he was, quote, not the adventurous type, but a steady-going, hard-thinking young Canadian, unquote, who saw it as his duty to enlist. He did so on December 3, 1914, as a member of the 25th Dragoons, a cavalry unit based out of Brantford. As a member of the 4th Canadian Mounted Rifles, Cockshutt was present when the group was decimated at Mount Sorel. Official histories and reports state that only 73 men answered to their name on June 3rd, putting the losses for the 4th Canadian Mounted Rifles on June 2nd at 89%. Given that some 1,160 men from the 4th CMR were listed as being in active service with the regiment immediately prior to June 2nd, it is believed that around 700 were in frontline active service at the time. On June 2, 1916, the 4th CMR held a portion of the Canadian front line at Ypres before being ambushed by the Germans. Leading his men into the fight, Cockshutt was severely wounded in the head. His men moved him into a shell hole and placed sandbags around it in order to provide as much protection as possible, but they were not able to move him to safety. Long believed to be a prisoner of war by family and friends, the official declaration was made by officials in Ottawa in February 1917, of Lieutenant Cockshutt's death on the 2nd of June the year before. He was one of 7 Cockshutts that fought in the Great War, and the only one not to come home. His uncles William F. and Henry Cockshutt were both prominent politicians that represented Brantford, as William F. was a member of Parliament and Henry was the Lieutenant Governor of Ontario. Additionally, Harvey's 4 cousins made it back to Brantford safely, though likely not unscarred. And upon his death, Harvey Cockshutt was 33 years old and unmarried. Major Panayoty Percy Ballachey was a member of the 58th Battalion, Canadian Expeditionary Force, and was killed on June 14, 1916, in Ypres, while Canadian forces were trying to regain the territory lost to the Germans on June 2nd and 3rd. He was a prominent dentist in Brantford and a member of the school board for 10 years before his enlistment. The Brantford Expositor, on June 19, 1916, states that, quote, the death of Major Panayoty Percy Ballachey brings home to the people of Brantford in a striking manner the sacrifice which so many of our Canadian business and professional men are making in order to serve the Empire at this time. Major Ballachey left home with his domestic ties, closed up his dental office, and resigned from the Board of Education because he felt it to be his duty to enlist for overseas service. And now he has sealed his devotion to his country with his life. He had counted the cost and was willing to pay the price. The example he and others like him have set ought to be a severe rebuke to the young men without similar responsibilities, who are not willing to give up their ease of comforts in order to fight for king and country, and also to those who are living lives of indifference to the tragedies of war." Unquote. Ballachey's wife, Fanny, was a cousin of William Charles Good, and following Panay's death, she received many letters of sympathy from men who served with him. One from a Major Castles states, quote, "I only wish to tell you how I and all the officers felt at the loss of the Major. We were all so fond of him and his ways. We were all so fond of him and his kind ways. I know the Colonel has written given you particulars. I can only add that you and the children may be proud of the courage shown by Major Ballachey. He really was wonderful and worked away without flinching in any manner. I personally felt his loss tremendously, as we've always seen a good deal of each other and got along splendidly." Unquote. Major Ballachey Elementary School was built in 1919 and was the first school built in Brantford after the armistice. Charlotte Edith Anderson Monture was the first Indigenous woman to become a registered nurse in Canada and to gain the right to vote in a federal election. The Military Service Act of 1917 had given wartime nurses the right to vote. However, Indigenous women as a whole could not legally vote federally until 1960. She was born in Canada, but she had to be trained as a nurse in the United States because the Canadian nursing schools refused her due to her race. She worked as an elementary school nurse, but left that job in 1917 to join the American Army Medical Corps. For the duration of the war, she served at military hospitals in France. She was one of 14 Canadian women who served as members of the United States Army Nurse Corps during World War I, and was one of a few Indigenous women who served overseas with them. For more than a year, she worked as a nurse at Base Hospital 23 in Vittel, France, treating soldiers injured by gas attacks and trench warfare. And after the war, Edith continued to advocate for better Indigenous health care. In 1939, she was elected honorary president of the Ohsweken Red Cross. At a hospital on the reserve, she worked as a nurse and midwife on a casual basis until 1955, when she turned 65. She passed away in 1996, a week before turning 106 years old. Alfred Henry Richardson was a Paris veteran and worked at the Penman's No. 1 mill before enlisting. He enlisted at 15 years old with the 25th Dragoons in Brantford, and later transferred to the Canadian Mounted Rifles out of Hamilton. Many people who knew him referred to him as Laughing Red, due to his happy demeanor and bright red hair. He was sent overseas with the 10th Calgary Battalion. He survived the battle at Hill 70 and was wounded at Vimy Ridge. He was very proud of the fact that he was the 4th in his battalion to go over the top at Vimy Ridge. Richardson was only back at the front for about 7 weeks before being gassed at Lens, and he suffered from cerebritis, a brain infection, as a result of the gas, and he was only 18 when he died. Katherine Maud MacDonald was born in Brantford on January 18, 1893. Upon her graduation as a nurse from the Victoria Hospital in London, MacDonald enlisted with the Canadian Army Medical Corps. Prior to heading overseas, she took the train to Montreal and then to Halifax. During this time, she exhibited such responsibility that she was put in charge of 19 other nurses. And she wrote home that, quote, "Some are old enough to be my mother. Why, far older than you, mother dear," unquote. In October 1917, she arrived at the No. 10 Stationary Hospital in Eastbourne, England. Once there, she was given more responsibilities while in the operating room. And in another letter home, she noted that the colonel in her unit was, quote, "tickled to death," unquote, and praised her up sky high for her work. In January 1918, she was transferred to the No. 1 Canadian General Hospital in Étampes, France. MacDonald was killed on May 19, 1918, when the No. 1 hospital was targeted by a German bombing raid. On May 21st, those that had died in the raid were given a soldier's burial. Katherine was remembered fondly by many as being brave, devoted, and loyal. Her fiancé, John Ballantyne, wrote to her mother that, quote, "She was a brave girl and so devoted to her duty in the cause of justice and the relief to the suffering that she had made the supreme sacrifice. Her heart and soul were in her work and nothing was too extreme for her powers," unquote. Matron Delaney, from the No. 10 Stationary Hospital in Eastbourne, also wrote to Mrs. MacDonald following Katherine's death. She noted that, quote, "It is with the deepest feeling of sorrow and regret that I am writing to you and enclosing a letter from the matron of the hospital where your little daughter was stationed. And while I feel that this is most heartbreaking to you, there is true consolation in knowing just what happened. She was always a favorite, and her death came as a great shock, for we felt she belonged to us. It is very hard for us to understand why so much sorrow is sent here, and just why her sweet life should be taken so cruelly. Our deepest sympathy is extended to you, and while these sad days will end sometime, we know the scars upon our hearts can never heal, and we only ask for the courage to keep going." Unquote. Born July 3rd, 1892, Lieutenant Lorne Henry Rehder was the only son of Henry Rehder, a business owner in Paris, Ontario. He was a graduate of BCI before studying commerce and finance at Victoria College in Toronto. He volunteered in November 1915 with the 125th Brant Battalion before transferring to the 54th Battalion out of Brantford, and he went to France in April of 1918. He was loved by everyone who met him, and was involved actively with the YMCA and the Methodist Church in Paris. He wrote home in June of 1918, quote, "By the way, Lieutenant Jack Orr has won the Military Cross, which is splendid. He has only been in France some 6 months, but has done fine work with his company, and pulled off a bit of a very daring work in a night patrol capturing a Hun sergeant. He got the Military Cross for it and deserved it too. The first honor for the 125th Battalion." Unquote. Rehder, Orr, and Douglas Hamilton all attended Brantford Collegiate around the same time. And Rehder was hit by a shell fragment and was killed on August 8, 1918, during the first day of the Battle of Amiens. Now, Lieutenant Douglas K. Hamilton was born April 15, 1893, in Port Stanley, and Hamilton was a graduate of BCI and Victoria College as well. He was appointed to the 125th Battalion in October 1915 and went overseas in August of the next year. Hamilton was good friends with Lieutenant Rehder and also transferred to the 54th Battalion in France in April of 1918. Both died on the same day as well, August 8, 1918. Lieutenant Colonel Carey wrote of Hamilton, "He was most popular and extremely efficient, and I have no hesitation in saying that he was one of the best and most conscientious officers of the battalion." Born in Brantford on January 17, 1895, John Percy Orr attended the Victoria School as well as Brantford Collegiate Institute. While at BCI, he became connected with the Cadet Corps and was a member of the basketball and football teams. He was also a member of First Baptist Church and was associated with the YMCA. After a preliminary course of training at a Niagara camp in the summer of 1915, he received a commission as lieutenant in the 1st Brant Battalion. After spending about 15 months in training in England, he was selected to go with a draft of officers to France, joining with the 54th Battalion in November of 1916. He was granted the Military Cross in April 1918 for conspicuous gallantry and devotion to duty when in charge of a fighting patrol. Not long after, he had a bar added to his Military Cross for further distinguished service. Orr was shot in the leg by an enemy sniper on November 2, 1918, and succumbed to his wounds on November 8th. Born on October 24, 1872, Matron Annie Jane Hartely attended the Collegiate Institute on George and Marlborough Street before studying nursing at the Toronto General Hospital. She held many nursing positions locally before heading overseas in May 1915 as the matron of the No. 4 Canadian General Hospital. She first arrived at Shorncliffe in England. She was later sent to hospitals in Étampes, France, and Saloniki, Greece, in November 1915. She remained in Greece for 2 years before returning to England in 1917. In November of that year, Hartely was awarded the Royal Red Cross with Bar by King George for her services. She wrote home that, quote, "There were 154 officers and 14 nurses decorated that morning. We waited 1¼ hours until our turn came. It was most impressive to see all the officers line up and go in. Some were very young, 20 years and older. The king was very nice to them, and he looked very worn and tired." Unquote. She was also presented with the Florence Nightingale Medal and the King's Jubilee Medal. After being demobilized in July 1919, Hartely continued her nursing profession in southern Ontario as the matron for both the Department of the Soldiers' Civil Re-establishment Hospital in Burlington and later the Christie Street Hospital in Toronto. After this, she was appointed Matron-in-Chief of Hospitals, Pensions, and National Health, which required her to inspect hospitals across the country. She retired due to ill health in 1938 and spent the remainder of her time at home on Niagara Street in Brantford before her passing on August 21, 1944. Thanks for listening to this episode of the Brant Historical Society podcast. Join us next week as we discuss Brantford on the home front during the Second World War.